Good morning everyone. So for today we will presenting question number 5, which is how and why did human rights enter the international political process in Second World War. So basically this presentation will separately into 3 parts, which is for part 1, I Farah Fatihah and Madiatuna Shamira will cover up the introduction and how did human rights enter the international political process in Second World War, while second part and third part will cover up by Zauyudan and Najibullah on why did human rights enter the international political process since Second World War, and we'll wrap up the presentation. For the outline, the introduction, we will cover up the origin of human rights, and we will jump into the point on how did human rights enter the international political process on human rights conventions, and also the birth of United Nations, and then we divide it into 5 parts. For introductions, generally, human rights is the right that belongs to an individual or group of individuals simply for being humans or as a consequences of inherent human vulnerability or because they are requisite to the possibility of a just a society. So basically this is document asserting individual rights back then, which is the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the French Declaration on Rights of Men and Citizens, the US Constitution and Bills of Rights. However, this document lacking some aspects such as rights on women, people of color, members of certain social, religious, economic and political groups that led to modern human rights law nowadays. So basically on 1930s to 1940s, 6 million Jews and millions of Romanians perished at the hands of the Nazis. So after the Nazis came to power, they persecute the Jews and other groups, which they're taking their money and property, encouraging them to leave the country. And the outbreak of Second World War led to far more savage persecution, including mass killings. And also the Nazis get the Jews and other persecuted groups in concentration camps. So after the Nazis were defeated by Allied forces in Second World War, the world united to agree on minimum standards of dignity to be afforded to all human beings. These minimum standards became known as human rights, which they were recorded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and made enforceable in Europe under the Human Rights Convention, and the Convention articles prohibiting the torture, slavery, and forced labor clearly sought to confine such as barbaric treatment to history.
Part 1. How did human rights enter the international political process since World War II? So basically, there are 2 main factors why the human rights started to evolve since World War II, which is the first one, discriminations, and the second one is free speech and family life. For the discriminations, the Nazis' anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws, they has limited what jobs could be done by the Jews as well as their right of citizenship. So what the Human Rights Convention did, they include a right to freedom of thought, conscience and religions. They want to eliminate discrimination on sex, race, religion, political and national. For the free speech and family life, the German law, they under the Nazis specifically prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. So what did HRC do? They provide for a right to respect for private and family life as well as the right to marry. They want to protect against such discriminatory laws. Under the United Nations, in 1945, 15 nations has adopted the UN Charter, which is a document setting forth for the UN goals, functions and responsibility. Based on Article 1 of the Charter, they mention that they want to promote and they want to encourage respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language and religions. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly, they has adopted UDHR, which is has drafted by the representative with different legal and cultural background for all regions of the world. It set out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected. So basically, under the UDHR, there are 2 main important international covenants, which is International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, which is known as ICESCR, and the second one is International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is known as ICCPR. So for the ICESCR, they addresses those articles in the UDHR that defines an individual's right to basic necessities such as food, housing, and healthcare, which a state should provide for its citizens. And for the ICCPR, it articulates the specific liberty-oriented rights that a state may not take from its citizens. So they fight for the freedom of expressions and freedom of movement. So both of these covenants, they were adopted by the United Nations in 1966. Articles in the ICCPR establish a Human Rights Committee which consists of 18 independent experts who examine the progress report from states that are party of the covenants. Under the ICCPR, there are two optional protocols, which is the first one, individual complaint mechanism, which is the committee, they will consider complaints of one member state against another, and they also will provide a complaint procedure through which individuals can have grievances against their government heard in an international forums. And the second optional protocol is to abolish the death penalty. However, there are some countries that has misused the ICCPR Act, for example, in the case study of Sri Lanka. So in April 2019, one of the Sri Lankan author, which is known as Shaktika Satkumara, he was arrested under the Section 3, Subsection 1 of the ICCPR Act, which is no person shall advocate national, racial or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility or violence. So this author, he was arrested because they mentioned that he inciting religious violence, and because he published a short story about homosexuality and child abuse at the Buddhist temple in Sri Lanka. However, the short story does not convey hatred towards a religious group, as the short story does not actually advocate hatred towards the Buddhist community. So, some of the movement, they strongly condemns the attempts to pursue legal actions under the provisions of the ICCPR. Human rights organization CIVICUS and the ASEAN Human Rights Commissions, or known as AHRC, have asserted that the charges are spurious and a clear violations of the author's right to freedom of expression. So what happened was Satkumara next hearing is scheduled on December 2019, and if formally charged and convicted, he could face up to 10 years in prisons. Since 1948, UDHR has served as the foundation for 20 major human rights conventions. Many human rights conventions have entered into force, and some of them are still in the process of ratification. The ultimate goal is to protect and promote the basic human rights to every person and everywhere. When a United Nations member state ratifies a convention, it agrees to these three, which is to abide the provisions of the conventions, consent to be monitored, and change its law to conform the conventions. So, for the next one is Conventions on the Eliminations of All Forms of Discriminations Against Women, or we known as CEDAW. CEDAW is an international convention adopted in 1979 by the UN General Assembly. It described as an international bill of rights for women, and it came into force on September 3, 1981. The conventions define discriminations against women as any distinctions, exclusions or restrictions made on the basis of sex and everything that are related to the human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic or any other field. It also established an agenda of action for putting an end to sex-based discriminations. States ratifying the convention are required to enshrine male or female equality into their domestic legislations, repeal all discriminatory provisions in their laws, enact new provisions to guard against discriminations against women, establish tribunals and public institutions to guarantee women effective protections against discriminations, and take steps to eliminate all forms of discrimination practiced against women by individuals and organizations. For example, Bangladesh, they use CEDAW to help attain gender parity in primary school enrollment and has a goal to eliminate all gender disparities in secondary education in 2015, while Kenya, they use CEDAW to address differences in inheritance rights, eliminating discriminations against widows and daughters of the deceased.
So for the next one is the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment (CAT). So this convention requires states to take effective measures to prevent torture within their borders and forbid states to return people to their home country if there is a reason to believe they will be tortured, which is non-refoulement. This convention adopted by the United Nations General Assembly by 10 December 1984 and came into force on 26 June 1987. This establishment of a system of regular visits undertaken by independent international and national bodies to places where people are deprived of their liberty in order to prevent torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. And the Committee Against Torture (CAT) is a body of human rights experts that monitors implementation of the convention by state parties. So basically, CAT has identified the following three elements that, if combined, it constitutes torture, which according to Article 1, which international infliction of severe pain of suffering for a specific purpose such as to obtain information as punishment or to intimidate for any reason based on discrimination and by or at the instigation of or with the consent of acquiescence of state authorities. So that is led to the according to Article 2 CAT, which each state party shall take effective legislative, administrative and judicial or other measures to prevent acts of torture in any territory under its jurisdiction, which no exceptional circumstances either the state is under threat of war or in political instability or emergency. So for example, in Cantora Benavides against Peru, the Inter-American Court found that according to international standards for protection, torture can be inflicted not only via physical violence but also through acts that produce severe physical, psychological or moral suffering in the victim. And the Human Rights Committee also found in Policampos against Peru that displaying the victim publicly in a case and isolating him for 23 hours a day in a small cell with only 10 minutes of sunlight per day violated Article Prohibition of Inhuman Treatment and Article 10 concerning the treatment of persons deprived of liberty. So for next one is Convention on the Rights of the Child (CRC), international convention setting out the civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights of children. The UN General Assembly adopted the convention into international law on November 20, 1989, while it came into force on September 2nd on 1990. And it defines a child as any person under the age of 18 unless an earlier age of majority is recognized by country's law. And the convention has two optional protocols, which is optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. So according to Article 1 CRC, a child means every human being below the age of 18 years unless under the law applicable to the child majority is attained earlier. So that, according to Article 2, the state party should respect and ensure the rights set forth in the present convention to each child within their jurisdiction without any discriminations, and the state party shall take all appropriate measures to ensure that all the child is protected against all forms of discriminations or punishment. So for example, India has ratified UNCRC on 11 December 1992, which there is a law that children under the age of 18 should not work, but there is no outright ban on child labour and that the practice is generally permitted in most industries except those that deem hazardous. While in 2016, the Child and Adolescent Labour Amendment Act was introduced, which prohibited economic employment of children under the age of 14 years and prohibited employment of adolescents 14 to 17 years of age in hazardous occupations. While in Saudi Arabia, they has ratified the convention in 1996, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which reviews Saudi Arabia's treatment of children under the convention in January 2005, strongly condemned the government for its practice of imposing the death penalty on juveniles, calling it a serious violation of the fundamental rights, And in its report, the Saudi Arabian government has stated that it never imposes capital punishment on persons below the age of 18. International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Family (ICRMW). The convention constitutes a comprehensive international treaty regarding the protection of migrant workers' rights. Its existence sets a moral standard and serves as a guide and stimulus for the promotion of migrant rights in each country. This convention entered into force on July 1st, 2003, and their primary objective of the convention is to foster respect for migrants' human rights. And the convention does not create new rights for migrants but aims at guaranteeing equality of treatment and at the same working conditions, including in case of temporary work for migrants and nationals. And all migrants should have access to have a minimum degree of protection because migrant workers is also a human being. And according to Article 7 ICRMW, state parties should respect and ensure to all migrant workers and members of their families within their territory or subject to their jurisdictions the right provided for in the present convention without distinction of any kind such as to sex, race, color, language, religion, and any other aspect that lead to Article 9 that the right to life of migrant workers and members of their families shall be protected by law. So for part 1, we can conclude that human rights enter the international political process by this convention listed, and the part 2 will be pursued by Zhao Yudan and the Najib Ullah. Thank you from Farah Fatiha and Madiatul Noshamira.